Hi, and welcome to the OT is In, the podcast where we merge the worlds of education and occupational therapy to empower families like yours. I'm Sarah Collins, your host, an occupational therapist and a homeschooling parent. I've experienced occupational therapy by supporting families for over 15 years, but also through seeking out support of my own children, so I'm right here in the trenches with you. Though there is not one way to educate your child, there is a lot to consider when individualizing an education. And the goal of this podcast is to explain some of the why behind what an occupational therapist is thinking so you can apply it to your own family. Especially with my three favorite topics: executive functioning, handwriting, and sensory processing. Each episode will be packed with practical tips, expert interviews, and real-life stories aimed at helping you to create a supportive learning environment for your child. So, grab your headphones and get ready to dive in of the collision of education and occupational therapy. I'm Sarah Collins from Homeschool OT, and I'm thrilled to have you with me on this journey of discovery. Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Homeschool OT, the OT is In podcast, where we delve into the world of homeschooling through the lens of occupational therapy, and today, speech therapy as well. In today's episode, we're joined by Keisha Berry, a speech language pathologist and seasoned homeschooling mom. We'll explore her journey from being a special education teacher to choosing homeschooling for her own children, leading to the establishment of her practice, Spectrum Education and Therapy Center. Our conversation with Keisha will cover the challenges and the triumphs of homeschooling and the importance of community support like co-ops, and how parents can navigate educational spaces for children with diverse learning needs. Keisha also sheds light on how to create neuro affirming environments and the crucial role of conflict management and advocacy in nurturing inclusive and supporting educational experiences. Before we get started, a little note on language. As educators, we know that language is ever evolving. Vocabulary grows as kids develop and words change context as cultures shift. For years, even generations, person-first language was encouraged. This means we would say a person with autism. However, in recent years, we have learned from the autistic community that identity-first language is preferred. This means saying autistic person rather than person with autism. And in addition, in recent years, the terms neuro affirming, neurodivergent, neurodiverse, and neurotypical arose. During this episode, Keisha does a great job of defining these terms. And even more recently, neurotypical is now being replaced with neuromajority, reminding us that there is not one correct or typical way to think and process information, though some neurotypes are more common than others. So join us in learning and using this vocabulary to help make our co-ops and homeschool communities more inclusive. Also, join us in extending grace as the language continues to evolve. You will even hear me slow down a time or two and stumble once, as evolving language requires growth and intentionality. Now, let's dive in. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to talk about occupational therapy as a whole. Clearly, if you're listening to the OT is In podcast, then you have heard of occupational therapy, but maybe not the vast yet personalized role that we cover. Occupational therapy helps people develop the skills they need to perform daily activities that they specifically need and want to do. This is very personalized. Some activities everyone needs to do, like dressing, bathing, eating. Some activities are unique to an individual. I know I don't need to know how to visually track a hockey puck before someone checks me, but my son does, so we've worked extensively on those visual motor skills that he needs. So if there are areas where your child is struggling throughout the day, an OT may be able to help. Homeschool OT supports the family to figure out the why behind the struggle, and then in how to use the homeschool to help your child be successful in what they need and want to do. We simultaneously educate occupational therapists on the homeschool community with the goal that no homeschool family will enter therapy and not feel supported in their educational choices. So, if you have a child struggling in any activity that they need and want to do during the day, go to the webpage for this episode and download the free Why Choose OT guide. Or go to homeschoolot.com for our classes, community, and consultations so we can help support your homeschool. So now let's get on with today's show. All right. Hey, welcome back to the Homeschool OT. The OT is in podcast. I have with me today a friend that I met actually 2 or 3 years ago. We think maybe during the pandemic, we were just kind of talking and trying to remember connecting because she's a speech therapist and also a homeschooling mom who you graduated at least one, right?
I did, yes, in 2022.
Beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and let you first introduce yourself, and then we're going to dive into this amazing topic that I think everyone is going to find really interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's see, where do I begin? Because it all is kind of mashed together with how I've become what I've become today. So my oldest started off in school as an elementary student, and he was having some difficulties there. I started getting comments on his report card that he was inattentive and hyperactive. At that point, I needed to make some decisions about what school was going to be like because academically he was excelling. He was going to a great level above what he was in, and he was doing well academically. And so homeschooling ended up being the option that I chose. It was supposed to be temporary, but here we are 13 years later.
Story of my life too.
And during that process, so I was a special education teacher at that time. And when I decided to homeschool him, I was finishing up grad school to become a speech language pathologist. And so now I kind of do the education, the speech therapy, and the homeschooling all together. And I've been doing them all about the same amount of time. It's been about 13 years.
Wow. So now how many other kids do you still have at home with you that you're homeschooling?
Yeah, so I have a fifth grader, a
All right.
second grader, and a 4-year-old.
Oh,
So
wow. Yeah.
that's
So your 4-year-old will never have, well, none of them, the rest of them will ever have known differently than homeschooling, right?
that's correct. Yep. The other three have not been to school and it doesn't seem like they're going to.
Like they're going to. Wow, congratulations. What a fantastic success story. So tell me a little bit about what you do professionally now.
Yeah, so my practice, Spectrum Education and Therapy Center, prior to the pandemic, it was really in my heart that I
Mm.
wanted to support homeschool families who had children who were neurodiverse. And so it was really hard to convince people that it could be done. And so I decided that I would go full time just working at my practice in 2019. And then the pandemic happened. So people didn't really have a choice. And
Right.
that's where we found a lot of families who were looking for support at that time. Many of those families decided to continue. So a lot of our current clients actually came from 2020 and they've been homeschooling ever since, but we provide a variety of services. We're a multidisciplinary practice, so we do psychological evaluations, which includes diagnostics and other testing. We have counseling now. We just added that service, but then we also do speech OT, PT, and some behavior support as well.
And where? Because I know there's people that are always like, wait, who?
Yes.
Homeschool friendly, where?
Yeah, so we are physically in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. However, I will say that during the pandemic, we weren't able to see people. And so we have many families that are actually working with us from other states. So we're national, we're in other states. All of our providers aren't even in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. So we're kind of spread out a little bit. If there's a family that needs support, if we can't do it, then we are in enough professional groups where we can post a question and say, hey, can somebody
Yeah.
help this family? So we try to connect families to resources.
Oof, I love that. That is such a need in our community of how do we find the professionals that are homeschool friendly, that understand neurodiversity. Yes, I'm so grateful that you're here. But what we wanted to talk about today a little bit is from your mom and homeschool mom and professional experience, right? How do we, when we're thinking about co-ops, how do we, especially those of us who have kids who are neurodiverse or looking at things in a different way, right? Or maybe have struggles in certain academic subjects, how can we find a spot that's going to be loving to our kids?
That is a really important question. And here's the thing about homeschool co-ops. More often than not, they are run by other parents. The thing about other parents is they may not be in the spaces where we are using some of these new terms. So if you ask a co-op, are you neuro affirming? Right. And I know that's something that we're going to get to, but basically, do you value who students are, all of the different neurotypes, and is that something that you value? They may not be able to answer that question, not because they're not, but because they don't even know what the term means.
Right, like what you're talking about. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Even when I talk to somebody, I mean, my mother was a lifetime educator, but she's 76. So when I'm using these new terms with her, she's like, well, what is that? Right?
Yeah.
We're using terms now that people who might actually know what we're talking about if we change our language would be more familiar with. So I think it's really important to ask questions and to define terms, for the people that you're talking to, so that not only can you educate them, but you can also, sort of establish what it is that they're already doing, and get some real specific information about whether or not you think that would be a good fit for your family.
I love that. So let's maybe start there. So can you define, well, maybe let's start with defining neuro affirming, since you use that word, and then we'll dive into some of the others that I've already heard you say. So what would you say, what does neuro affirming mean?
So neuro affirming is essentially not requiring anyone to fit. It is a space and an environment where everybody's needs are met in one location, right? So if somebody's needs aren't met in one space, it's not really neuro affirming, right? Neuro affirming means I'm not expecting a child who is different to behave in this typical manner, or to think in this typical manner, or to socially interact in this so-called typical manner. I am embracing all students and all participants for wherever they are, whoever they are, and our environment welcomes that.
I love how you mentioned think and behave, right? You put both of those together, which is such a huge, I don't know, almost even controversy when we are leading by or being led by other parents, oftentimes who have certain expectations for behavior and may not be able to decipher. So when you're asking these questions, right, and saying, are you neuro affirming? What can you say your difference is, or how can we help to define what is the difference between like the way you think and the way that behavior is, and how do we know what to expect?
Yeah, I mean, so a question that I might ask, let me think about this. So, a question that I might ask a parent. Remember, I'm speaking to a parent, I'm not speaking to another. I mean, of course, if you're running the co op, then that's a different conversation. And I do want to say that there are specialists or parents that have neurodiverse learners who have started co ops. That's a different conversation. You could probably use all of the terms that you'd like. But coming into a space where they may not be familiar with that language, you might ask a question like, here's an example of what my student does when they don't understand the information. They put their head down on the table and they cover their face and they refuse to engage. Some people may interpret that as disrespectful. And so what you would have to, kind of share is that he's not intending to be disrespectful. He's actually communicating something to you. Is this a space where that form of communication, is it something that we can work with? Because sometimes you mentioned behaviors. A lot of times we do have a framework of what we believe is acceptable. But neuro affirming means that you actually have to learn that communication is not talking, right? Actually embracing, responses. Let's just call it a response. Maybe not a verbal response. It may be a physical response. It may be tossing a paper on the floor. It may be giving a hug when perhaps somebody doesn't want it. Right. So all of these responses are not necessarily negative responses, but this is where the child is. Are you willing to work with me to take them where we both want to see them and where they would like to be?
I love that because it helps you to show, I am the expert in my kid, right? But here are some things that he or she may do and what it might look like. You're using story and really kind of explaining, not expecting that someone's going to know, but afterwards then expecting, okay, so here's what we've kind of laid out. Let's put a plan in place so that everybody feels comfortable.
Yes.
I love that. I love that. So coming from the other side, right? So those of us who may be leading co-ops, how could we be trying to encourage more of this diversity?
I love that question. Well, first of all, you can encourage it by making sure that your content and the words that you are using to talk to children about other children are inclusive, right? You can embrace the idea that people think differently. And even if for example, in a math class, you may teach 3 different strategies for multiplication, and you may say, for some of you, you will embrace this strategy because this is how you learn best, but for others, you might embrace the second strategy, and they're both equal. We get to the same location, we get to the same place. Another thing that you might do, especially, and this is near and dear to my heart, with communication devices, children that have communication devices. Sometimes parents are a little reserved with bringing them into spaces. One, they don't want them broken. That's obviously a very a very valid concern. But also embracing or modeling using the device, right? So actually, when children have communication devices, we should use them to communicate to the student, and the student should use them to communicate to us. And so it's a great opportunity when you ask a student a question. You don't always have to hold up 2 pictures or 2 icons to give them choices. Help them navigate to where they need to be on their device. And you'd be surprised, sometimes the kids jump right in there. So we are in a technology age.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways to just make sure that your content is inclusive, your teaching approaches are inclusive, so that by the time somebody who is different shows up, it's not brand new to your students. You've already kind of done the pre-work for that.
Right, right. So then we as adults are kind of leading the charge in this, but the students are kind of following right along.
Yes.
So one piece of this though is conflict management. So you did mention, it might be that a child wants to give a hug, even though that wasn't what you were expecting right then or whatever. What are some ways that we can talk to our students, especially about conflict management, when people may not be thinking in the exact same way or have the same expectations at home?
Yeah, I mean, conflict management is something that you sort of establish at the beginning of the year. I think one thing that dissolves co-ops is conflict management between adults.
Adult, yep.
So if we approach it from the beginning, this is how we resolve conflict. This is if somebody does something or touches you, or in terms of giving a hug or says something to you that you don't like, this is how I expect you to respond. Many co-ops actually have parents present, not all of them, but sometimes present. So this is when you should seek an adult. But there are lots of opportunities to incorporate how children should interact. And the thing about homeschoolers is that not only are we teaching our children, but we're raising them as well. So character development is a part of just what we do naturally.
Right.
Right. If they don't get it from us, where are they going to get it?
How many other options? You're with me all the time. Yeah, totally. So kind of where I'm going with this. So in one of my co-ops, I'm in, actually our families are in several of them. We've experienced or seen, where kiddos who can't quite advocate for themselves yet, or don't know how to advocate for themselves yet, but then others, the perception of what they're doing, especially from kids, right? The perception of what they're doing and how they're behaving can be like, ooh, that's a bad kid, right?
Yeah.
So how do we kind of talk through that with our kids, whether we're talking through to the kid who's the bad kid, who actually, if you could see my quotes there, because I don't believe that's a thing, right? There's not a thing as such as a bad kid, but this might be what your child is labeled because they are watching and seeing the behavior, right? So how can we help our kids to understand neurodiversity and behaviors?
Yeah, I think once that your child is exposed, I mean, sometimes some of us will, so for example, as a speech pathologist, and this is the field that I work in, there are lots of books in our home library that talk about this, that talks about differences. But let's assume that this is something that is brand new to a family. It's a new concept. So the same way that you would teach a new math concept or a new health concept or a new social studies concept, now it's time to embrace a new topic because it's something that we're dealing with. And I would say that one thing that homeschool families are really good at is when something comes up, we talk about it. I had no plans this year to talk about the eclipse. Zero. I had zero plans to talk about it. Didn't even
Me neither.
My sister, who's a science geek, she flew to New York so that she could see the full. I had no plans, but what did I do? We pivoted, right? So we stopped and we saw that this is something that is happening around us, and it's time to talk about it. Library resources. I call it
You make some glasses randomly on the day. Yeah, you did.
glasses.
I'm like trying to make them out of cereal boxes.
But what do we do? Just like
Yep.
anything, when something new comes into your space and there's something that needs to be introduced, you do what you already do as a home educator. You find the resources, go to YouTube. AI is my thing these days. Go to Chat GPT or whatever, whatever resource, that you use.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned, we find clearly resources, we find books, like you can go to the library. There right now are so many books that are being published recently about neurodiversity, also having characters that are going to be maybe in a wheelchair or using a communication device. Like there are so many different opportunities where we can see. I love Amber Johnston's work. She talks a lot about books that are windows into other people's lives and then books that are mirrors to see our own, but being intentional about finding the books that are going to be windows into neurodiversity, right? So that people can see and know and how to act and how to interact.
Yeah. And when it comes to tolerance and embracing others and inclusion, this is like a quiet kept secret, but Sesame Street is still out here and they have a ton of resources. Yes, a ton of resources they have available where you can talk to your children about a variety of topics.
I'd like to take just a second in the middle of this episode to make sure that you know about the OT is in membership community. In a world brimming with parenting advice and a myriad of how to homeschool guides, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, especially when none seem to fit your unique child quite right. We here at Homeschool OT understand that each child is a one-of-a-kind masterpiece with their own distinct strengths and weaknesses, needs and desires, interests and dislikes. That's why the Homeschool OT membership exists, to empower you on this remarkable educational path. So run by me, a dedicated occupational therapist, our membership is your gateway to a world of personalized, child-centric homeschooling. The membership offers weekly office hours for open question and answer, an exclusive resource library with printables, webinars, and even research updates where the worlds of OT and homeschooling collide. There's a community forum to share and learn from others like you, and a book club to grow and be the parent your unique kids need, which even often includes time with the authors of these books. There's also discounts on consultations and other services from the Homeschool OT. So we would love to have you join to celebrate the uniqueness of your child while you gain support and understand the why behind some of your child's struggles. Also help to accommodate their needs and then support their successes and what they need and want to do. So go to homeschoolot.com to find out more about the membership, or even more specifically, homeschoolot.com/join-the-membership. Now, back to the show. So Keisha, you've talked some about the interaction both ways, right? And even about conflict management and about what we can do to, join co-ops and to recruit people for co-ops. What about as our kids get older and they're starting to need to be able to advocate for themselves? This is a question that I get frequently. How do we teach our kids kind of what to say so that they can express what they need?
Yeah, a lot of role playing, a lot of scenarios. And to be honest with you, with some kids, that role playing doesn't always carry over. Right? It doesn't always carry over because a child may be able to do something in the context of a story and identify the correct response, or in the context of flashcards and identify a correct response. But when it comes to actually interacting with a child, that's where sometimes you see conflict or there's a breakdown. I would definitely suggest going back and reviewing scenarios that happened to see if the child that is learning to advocate for themselves can see where they might have done something differently. But also, one of the concepts that we kind of mentioned that we were going to mention was that double empathy component.
Yes.
Right? And so double empathy is where you have two different people with entirely different social experiences and social lenses. and they are very likely to clash or have an experience where they misinterpret each other's behavior. And so it's a two-way street. And what
Right.
neuro affirming really means is it is not the responsibility of the child who has the diagnosis to figure this out.
And to adapt.
And exactly. And I think that is so important because a lot of times I have to remind parents, it is not always your responsibility and your child's responsibility to adapt. Sometimes people need to adapt to you, and you deserve
Yes.
you deserve that, because it is not, the children who might be considered neurodiverse who need to do the changing. More in many situations that I see, it's actually the other way around. Like the children who would be considered to have a more common neuro profile, those are the ones that need some education and some support with learning how to interact with those who to this earth like them.
Oh gosh, that's so important. Do you know what? There are even times when I have heard people say like she's a bully, like bullies are, or he's a bully, whatever. That term can just be really because we're interacting in different ways. And so for us to look and try to change ourselves, or not even have to change, but to accept and to empathize and to recognize where another person's coming from, that is so key, yet so hard for many people to understand.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing about bullies, and I always have to have this conversation, especially when it comes to speech therapy and we're working on social skills.
Mhm.
Manners, and then there are social skills, and those are not the same thing.
Well, that said,
There are manners and there are social skills, and they are not the same thing. So when it comes to things like dealing with bullies,
Yeah.
right? You can advocate for yourself, you can do the right thing. That is what, as a parent, you would love to just teach, say, leave me alone, and that would be an appropriate response. But you do have to sometimes think about those hard choices that your children have when bullies are verbally bullying,
Mhm.
bullying. You have to have a correct response. And it's even harder when they get older, right?
Right.
Especially depending on what spaces they're in, because for a 16 or 17-year-old that's running to tell an adult, that's adding on to being socially stigmatizing. So they actually need some strategies, which parents really have to think about that. How do you
Yeah.
truly want your child to engage with a bully in the absence of adults?
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
Because that part's important, because adults will usually step up, but in the absence of adults, how do you want them to respond? And manners and social skills.
Yeah, not always the same.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about social skills groups, right? So can you describe that from a speech language pathologist perspective? Like what exactly would that be?
Yeah. So this is a really good question, because I think that one challenge that we often have with social skills groups is that everybody in the group is working on something.
Mhm.
Everybody is there because there's some reason, especially if we're at a practice that's working with insurance, like there has to be something that has been diagnosed that indicates that there are deficits, or there's a need in the area of social skills. That's kind of a hard group to work in,
Right.
because you almost need a child who doesn't necessarily meet the criteria for a diagnosis to be present, so that you can practice those skills with others. So in our social groups, there are variety. It's neuro spicy, right? There's a
Okay.
little bit of this, a little bit of
Yeah.
that. Some children who have gone through the diagnostic process, some kids are just there for the fun. So on a lot of our social skills programs, you see some kids are here for the therapy, some kids are just here for the fun. A
Mhm.
great example of that is gaming, right? So we do regular gaming meetups in person where we get together and we play video games. Now, this is
Yeah.
one of those examples where manners and social skills are two different things.
Right.
Because saying excuse me politely on a video game,
Yeah. That's not gonna happen.
right? But then we're into, yeah, you do have to yell to get your point across.
Yeah. Yeah.
You might need to yell to your buddy on the headset, but then we're also teaching, hey, don't yell. That's not appropriate. We don't yell at people, but sometimes you do actually
But
yell.
sometimes we do. Right.
Sometimes you do,
Right.
yeah. So social skills groups, what I in an ideal world, what it would look like is there's an opportunity for those skills to be practiced in real world situations. I think there's a time and a place for everything. Sometimes we get all of the kids together who are working on a particular skill, but there has to be an opportunity for them to practice in the presence of where you expect those social skills to be used.
And I actually love that you're talking about, as we mentioned, the double empathy problem, how we have to be able to interact for more than one person to be able to figure out, okay, this is where a person's coming from, right? So it's not just the skills for the neurodiverse population, right? It is also for
Yeah. Absolutely. I have my fifth grader, very soft spoken, very kind, and gaming is not necessarily her sweet spot, right? Because she's asking, can you come over here with me? Or, can you please join me when they're, playing in these worlds where there's multiple kids. I don't even know the names of the games.
you're like, I know what's going on down there.
Exactly. Players like that, sometimes I have to tell her, you have to raise your voice a little bit.
Yeah, right.
Something in our house that we say it with your chest, which means like be bold, be confident, be confident about it. And so
Right.
that's something that she had to learn. But on the flip side, with children who may be, a neurospicy, and I love that word. That's a new term that I've seen going around as well. For kids who are working on social skills, they can get really angry during gaming.
Yeah.
And that's something that we have to work through, because if you love to game, you're going to lose sometimes.
Right.
And we need to work through that. And that might not be available in a setting where, the speech pathologist prevents you from losing so that you don't have an explosive reaction, where actually you may need to, kind of win on purpose so that we can work through that reaction,
Yeah, and practice it.
or win fairly, not on purpose. But if you win, you win. And then we have to discuss, how to manage those feelings.
So good. So you've given us a lot to think about, specifically as we're kind of gearing down from one homeschool year. And I know there's a lot of people who are starting to think about next year and looking at what is the community and how can we make sure that all of our kids are going to be accepted in this community, but also our kids, are they going to be accepting to other people, and some resources to go through that. So good. So thank you so much for being here. Can you tell everyone how to find you, and whether they're coming for social skills groups, whether they're coming for, maybe you might be a co-op leader where they are.
Possibly. I have to get that out the way first. Yes, absolutely. So my website is www.setc, that's for Spectrum Education Therapy Center, setclearning.com. I'm also on IG, SEC Learning, and you can follow us there and just kind of see the things that we post about. And of course, we give free consults to all new families. So if we can help you, please reach out. If we can't help you, usually we can connect you with a resource that you need.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.